Hello, this is Paul Schiff Berman. I'm a law professor at George Washington University Law School, and here are the top 5 legal stories from this past week. First of all, Donald Trump's authoritarian takeover of American institutions is proceeding in increasingly dangerous ways. He's now seeking to take over Federal Reserve policymaking by purporting to remove Federal Board of Governors member Lisa Cook. Trump has already destroyed the independence of many of the various so-called independent administrative agencies by firing those agency heads even when Congress gave them removal protections that would require their only being removed for cause. And the Supreme Court has permitted him to do that based on a theory that anyone in the executive branch should be able to be fireable at will by the president under Article 2 of the Constitution. But even the Supreme Court drew the line at the Federal Reserve based on a history of independence of central bankers. And so the court indicated that it would likely not uphold firing a Federal Reserve board member at will. So now Trump has declared that he's firing Cook for cause. He's not firing her at will. For cause, what's the cause? Well, he's citing a vague allegation involving Cook's mortgage application, an allegation for which no evidence has actually been produced. Trump says that he gets unilateral discretion to decide what counts as valid cause for firing. But if that's true, then there's effectively no difference at all between a position that has for-cause removal protection and one where the president has freedom to fire at will. So the question, if it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, will be, will the Supreme Court allow Trump to make this end run around the very for-cause removal protections that the court itself said was essential for central bank independence? We'll see, but this is a major escalation, and it has dire consequences for the independence of our entire central banking system, and therefore our entire economy. And it's also further evidence that Trump will use the full force of the federal government to go after anyone who stands in his way. All right, the second legal issue of the week is that the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit has ruled that Trump does not have statutory authority to impose across-the-board tariffs. Now, unlike with a lot of the power grabs of the Trump administration, here there's no real credible argument that imposing tariffs is an inherent presidential power under Article 2 of the Constitution. Instead, the administration is claiming the authority under a congressional statute, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, also known as IEPA. But as the majority of the court recognized, that statute gives the president power to impose economic sanctions on other countries in an emergency, but it never once refers to tariffs at all, or any of its synonyms, such as duty or tax. The administration argues that the statute does allow the president to regulate importation, but the Court of Appeals, I think, rightly concluded that that does not include tariff authority because the power to impose a tax in law is usually distinct from the power to regulate. So it would be odd indeed to read into this statute an unlimited discretionary authority to the president to impose tariffs at will, given that the statute never mentions them. And that's particularly so given that the Supreme Court has in recent years developed a doctrine whereby the courts require Congress to be explicit whenever they delegate major discretionary authority to the executive branch, rather than letting the executive simply infer that power. Interestingly, the court did not address a possible additional argument, which is that Trump was not plausibly responding to an emergency, given that whatever economic harm Trump claimed to be addressing was not sudden, unforeseen, or necessary to be combated immediately. The court also did not address the fact that many of Trump's public justifications for many of his tariffs do not speak to an economic emergency at all, but instead are based on disagreements about various countries with regard to their laws or policies. So what happens next in that case? Well, the Court of Appeals paused its order to allow the Trump administration to seek review from the Supreme Court. And I expect that the court will agree to hear the case on its regular docket. So even if the court ends up affirming the Court of Appeals, Trump's tariff authority will remain in place until probably June. of 2026. And in the end, what will the court do? Well, that's anyone's guess, but I could imagine the majority saying that in areas of national security, Congress is presumed to give broad authority to the president or something like that, despite the complete absence of any textual language in the statute to support such an interpretation. That would be yet another unnecessary giveaway of power to the executive, but I guess we'll see what the Supreme Court does. In the third major story of the week, so-called Alligator Alcatraz, a federal court ordered the shutdown of the immigration detention facility that was built in the Florida Everglades and nicknamed Alligator Alcatraz. The court ruled that the hastily built facility was erected without going through the environmental review and public comment period that was required under the National Environmental Policy Act. It appears that the Trump administration is choosing to wind down that facility rather than appeal this ruling, but we'll see. Fourth, Trump keeps saying he wants to change voting rules. First, he said he wants to ban all mail-in voting, and then he said he wants to issue an executive order demanding stricter voter ID laws. But the Constitution is quite explicit that it is state legislatures around the country that determine the time, place, and manner of federal elections, which is why you have differences in procedures from state to state in the first place. The Constitution does allow Congress to pass federal legislation regarding voting, such as the Voting Rights Act, but nowhere does the Constitution empower the president to change voting procedures through an executive order. And I think in the end, even a Supreme Court dominated by Republican appointees is unlikely to allow a change like that via executive order. Now, maybe Trump could order federal election funding to be withheld from any state that doesn't adopt his chosen rules, but even that is likely unconstitutional. Of course, Trump could put pressure on Republicans in Congress to pass federal legislation, and they could do that, but they probably would need to abolish the Senate filibuster rule to do so, which so far they have not been inclined to do. So what's the purpose of Trump's statements if they're not actually going to have an impact? Well, it's part of an ongoing effort by Trump and his allies to sow distrust about our election system. And it's based on that distrust that Trump can later claim that election results are fraudulent and that he therefore does not have to obey them. So this is yet another way in which Trump is undermining democracy and the rule of law itself, even if what he's saying never becomes law. And finally, in non-Trump legal news, University of Pennsylvania law professor Amy Wax had her lawsuit against the university dismissed. Over many years, Wax had made multiple outrageous statements regarding Black and Asian students and their abilities. But when she was disciplined by the administration, she sued, claiming that she was the one being discriminated